Thanks for joining us for another Sunday program of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you're here. We have a nice big crowd for you today to talk about a very unusual story of Jewish history, which is about the Jewish presence in China. And we have two of the world's experts on this topic with us today. We have a moderator, my colleague Robert Jacobitz, who will introduce them in a moment. So I'll give him that privilege. But I do want to mention that I looked for quite a long time to find some sort of a film or video to send all of you in preparation for today's program. And I quickly came to the conclusion that there is nothing out there that does the job of telling the story as it should be told. So I'm inviting any of you who are filmmakers or who know filmmakers to look at the subject, because this is virgin terrain and we have two speakers here who would just be prime interviewees for such a film. So I'm very excited to be presenting the story about Shalom, China, the Jewish presence in that country. Robert Jacobitz, how are you today?
I'm well. Thank you, Olivia. It's wonderful to be here with you and the others.
Go ahead and introduce.
Okay, great. I'm very pleased that we have two very dynamic individuals who are our presenters today, each one an expert in the field, in their experiences. The first person we'll be hearing from is Nicholas Zane, who is a college student at Dartmouth, and to his credit has published 3 books at a very young age, I believe of 22. And he will tell you more about his interest in the history of Jews in China. And the other individual is ESTER BENJAMIN SHIFREN, who is herself a native of China, from a long line of Jewish presence in China and beyond. And she'll tell you more about her lineage and her family experiences before, during, and after the Second World War, when they were interned by the Japanese. First person will be Nick, then followed by Esther. Nicholas, please begin.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, so I'm Nicholas. I'm a student at Dartmouth College. I'm actually 20. I'm originally from Hong Kong, and I grew up in London going to a traditional English boarding school. So I was never really surrounded by Jewish communities, but I'd taken a profound interest in the history of Judaism and the Jewish religion. And I think one of the reasons for this is because I really wanted to learn about the world. And because Judaism is so diasporic in nature, learning about Jewish history and Jewish literature gave me an outlet through which I could learn about all of this sort of world. And that's why I kind of got drawn to sort of more niche topics. And so today I'm going to be really talking about the history of the Jews in Kaifeng, which are sort of the indigenous Jews in China and who are oftentimes not really, I guess, talked about within academia and both the sort of lay discussions. And so I guess Michael is going to pull up the slides now. So effectively, I think what's interesting about this is that the Jewish community in China, Kaifeng, is, right about in the east, quite close to where Beijing is. And so as you can see on the slides, it's right there. And so next slide, please. And so after learning about the sort of history of, Jews in Kaifeng through literature and through history books, I decided I wanted to take a trip to Kaifeng myself. And there I met with the Jewish community, including Esther here. What I thought was very interesting about this visit was that I was able to learn about how the community adapted to the different changes within their own community, within the sort of local communities, and how they sort of shaped themselves to fit in the Chinese communities. And as you see in the background, that's a model downscaled, obviously, of their synagogue. And it looks more like a Confucius temple than a synagogue, which is quite fascinating because it's definitely one of a kind. And on the right, you have a collection of the Torah scrolls that they had handwritten, except what's remarkable about these is that they're all handwritten in traditional Chinese characters. Next slide, please. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about the earliest evidence of Judaism in China first. And this would kind of bring us back to the 700s, where a Judeo-Persian manuscript was found in Western China in the Xinjiang region near the Taklamakan Desert. here, the sort of contents of the manuscript were really just sort of, it was written by a merchant who wanted to find help because he was being duped into buying bad sheep. And so it wasn't too sort of remarkable or profound in terms of content, but historically, this is incredibly significant. And as you can see from the manuscript on the left, this is, in Judeo-Persian, and it's now found in a library in Paris. Next slide, please. So now actually pivoting to the actual history of the Jews in Kaifeng. And so first of all, I kind of want to talk about why Kaifeng. Kaifeng was the sort of capital of China in around the 900s to 1100s era. And the reason Kaifeng was so important was because of its proximity to the Yellow River. And so it was kind of the trade, a hub of commerce and trade. And so the Jews came from sort of the Persian region, and they came as merchants. And they paid tribute in terms of textiles to the emperor himself, and the emperor granted them the ability to stay and live there in the capital. Next slide, please. And so this is a remarkable, another remarkable manuscript, and it shows the names of some of the members of the Kaifeng Jewish community. And what's so incredible about this is obviously you have, the Hebrew script right next to traditional or even classical Chinese characters. Now, I can read the Chinese, and I'm sure a lot of you can read the Hebrew, but I think the intersection of people who can read both is really quite sort of a small niche. And, hopefully I can sort of learn Hebrew and one day become part of that. But I think this is very interesting. And what's remarkable is this is actually currently held in Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. So if anybody of you are near there, you can go check it out. Next slide, please. And so the golden period of the Kaifeng Jews was under the Jin dynasty, under which China was ruled by Jurchen nomadic people. And because the nomadic rulers didn't have much experience governing a nation from a sort of systematic perspective, when they started to introduce paper currency, a new form of technology, there was also the issue of counterfeit currency, because you could, easily replicate paper. And so the problem with this is obviously it caused hyperinflation. And so the nomadic rulers, the Jurchens, needed help to sort of quell these struggles. And so the Jewish communities and the Muslim communities in China who had arrived as merchants had the sort of financial acumen to help deal with this. And so the Jewish community were an integral role in helping combat these hyperinflation problems. And soon thereafter, they were granted the rights of building a synagogue and gifted the land to do so. And so here on the left, you see the synagogue, which is, as mentioned, it looks much more Chinese than it, and there's some feng shui elements to it, which makes it quite a remarkable structure. Next slide, please. Now, I think what's interesting, my favorite part about the period of the Chinese Jewish history in Kaifeng is that the interactions with the Chinese community during the Ming Dynasty were actually incredibly interesting. And the downside of this was, while at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, the Jewish identity was very, very rich and solid, by the end of it, in around the 1650s, the Jewish community had weakened substantially for several different reasons, which I'm going to go into. Next slide, please. And so I think firstly, and one of the most important things was that the Ming Dynasty preceded the Yuan Dynasty. And so the Yuan Dynasty was a period during which the Mongolians were sort of ruling over China. And so when the Han Chinese people took back control of their country, they decided they wanted to reduce foreign influence. And so the way they did that was by instituting a constitution where foreigners must intermarry with the local population or must marry outside of their own communities. And this was interesting. This had interesting implications on the Jewish community in Kaifeng, as they were forced to marry outside of their own communities, and they had to intermarry with the Han Chinese and the Muslims. A lot of them sort of tended to marry with the Muslims because this meant that they wouldn't have to give up as much of their sort of practices. And the interesting dynamics here were sort of that, I guess, a lot of times when the mother is Jewish and therefore the children is, because it's matrilineal, this wouldn't be recorded in the Confucian family trees because women were not part of these Confucian family trees. And so you had a lot of interesting dynamics at play here. And so another factor that contributed to this, next slide, please, was the fact that the Jews in Kaifeng were incredibly sort of high achievers relative to their peers. And what this meant was that they were really sort of granted with a lot of privileges from the emperor himself. And so the emperor granted one of his personal physicians, who was a Kaifeng Jew, a Chinese surname. And throughout the next few hundred years, the Kaifeng Jewish community all were granted Chinese surnames, and they were now one of the 7. Ai, Gao, Jin, Li, Shi, Zhang, Zhao. However, these are extremely, sort of common Chinese surnames, and so there was not much room for distinction. And so throughout the ages, especially with intermarriage, it became much more difficult to trace down who was Jewish and who wasn't. And next slide, please. Okay, so here's also another interesting thing related to that. Because the Kaifeng Jewish community were extremely high achievers, they excelled at the Chinese imperial examinations, which allowed them to penetrate the top ranks of the civil service. But what this meant was that they were often taken away from Kaifeng and brought to sort of foreign provinces to become government officials. And so this kind of created an effective brain drain. The most qualified and the most educated of the Kaifeng Jews would be brought outside and as far away from their communities as possible in order to prevent sort of governance and governance sort of corruption. And finally, I think, and perhaps one of the biggest factors that contributed to the sort of loss of Jewish identity was the flooding that had happened. And so, as I mentioned, Kaifeng was, very close to the Yellow River. And this was a double-edged sword, because while you had, trade that happened very, very sort of easily, you also had a lot of floods. And so in 1642, there was a man-made flood. And the reason I say man-made was because there was a rebellion that happened in Kaifeng. And the rebels attempted they successfully broke the dikes of the Yellow River, and this caused a flood. And this killed about 300,000 of this, 400,000 people in the city, which is a remarkable amount. And the Jewish population in Kaifeng was reduced by more than half. And this kind of takes us to sort of, the discovery of the Kaifeng Jews, because while the Ming Dynasty saw the Kaifeng Jews as sort of lose their Jewish identity, it was also in turn preserved by Matteo Ricci, who is a Jesuit missionary who had encountered the Kaifeng Jewish community. So now Matteo Ricci was an Italian Jesuit, and he was, known for a lot of things, for creating the first world map in China, for instance. But he wasn't really known for his discovery of the Kaifeng Jews, but that it was indeed him who had met sort of a Kaifeng Jewish man and sort of was able to communicate with him and sort of bring the Kaifeng Jewish community into the European landscape and sort of allow the sort of Western nations to know about the Kaifeng Jews. And so kind of just to sort of stop right there, I think that one thing that I wanted to sort of just, I was just kind of bored one day. And so I decided to write a poem about the Kaifeng Jews. And here, it goes as such, I guess. Waves of Jews, eastwards we traveled, country by country we slowly unraveled. From Greece to India, the Ganges to China, for peace we fled because of the Messiah. Years had then passed and we stayed in our group, but the Ming Dynasty came and that ended the loop. Bestowed with the surnames Ai, Shi, and Jin, with Han Chinese neighbors, we soon became kin. And so I think that accompanying this poem are sort of 4 of my favorite photos that to me sort of are very meaningful because they represent a lot of what Chinese Jewry is. And, on the top left, you have, Hong Kong during the handover back to China in 1997, which is, Hong Kong's my hometown. And I thought it's a beautiful photo on the top left with a lot of symbols of both Judaism and Hong Kong and China. And then top right is a dragon menorah that you can find in Shanghai today. And then the bottom left is sort of a library section of Jews in China books that kind of inspired me to learn more about the topic. And the bottom right is the synagogue in Hong Kong during the handover as well. And so finally, I think that, next slide, please. And so here are the 3 books that I had written. The first book on the left was a sort of a narrative about all the Jewish communities in China. And then the next one is more of a timeline on the history of Jews in China. And the reason I created it as a timeline is because I wanted to create a documentary on the history of the Kaifeng Jews. But to create a documentary, I thought I had to first create like a timeline. And so I created the timeline, and then it turned out as a full-time college student, it's very hard to sort of travel around the world and film stuff. So I decided, you know what, let me just first publish this, and then let's see what happens after I graduate. And finally, on the right hand side, it's kind of like, it's always been my goal to reach as big of an audience as possible. And so I think the best way to do this is sort of to create books that are more accessible for children. And so children can learn about these cross-cultural dialogues from a young age and sort of grapple with issues of identity and multiculturalism. And I think that's very important. And so yeah, thank you for listening, and I will hand it over to Esther.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to be part of this program. And I'm beginning with my first part of my story. If you show my slides, I'll be able to tell you what's happening. And I'm waiting for Michael to put up a slide. We're starting with the Treaty of Nanking, because that is when my family actually settled in Xinjiang province after the Opium Wars that had been fought so bitterly, and the British were given concessions, and they signed a treaty and got 5 treaty ports. And the first wave of Jewish migration came from 1843, which is when we more or less arrived, until 1920. And this was marked by the arrival of Sephardic Jews from Bombay and Baghdad, and included the Benjamin ancestors, which are my family. The first wave of settlers actually began coming in earnest in 1848. At the time, in the 20s and the 30s, this was the Bund. The Bund was an extremely exciting place. And by the way, the Bund is not a German word. The Bund is Hindustani for waterfront. And many people don't know that, but you can look it up, and it's absolutely true. And any time that you were on the Bund, there was huge excitement happening, because the ships were, Shanghai had no restrictions, no visa requirements. So people and goods were constantly coming on and off ships. Any day you could see the menial laborers, who they called derogatively coolies in Shanghai, would come off with huge bags and bundles on their backs, and cases and boxes, and they would go, hey ho, hey ho. And all parts of the river were so full of ship fare, sampans and big ships and small items. And in the Chinese philosophy is that if someone fell off one of the boats, where people sometimes lived for the rest of their lives, you had the responsibility to look after that person if you saved them, because you had interfered with their destiny. Now, on the way to this amazing Bund, which had all these buildings that were built by the British, and they had to dig pylons deep into the ground in order to put up these buildings to keep them sturdy enough, because Shanghai was regularly flooded by the river every year, and the buildings would have just disintegrated and floated away, I guess. So it's a tribute to this building that these are still standing. And the Chinese have kept them there because they're very good for tourist attraction. Also, you'll see the clock on the top there, that's called the Big Ching. It was the clock by which Shanghai, everyone except the Japanese, kept time to. The Japanese still kept Tokyo time, and they were staying in Hongqiu mainly. So, okay, so on the way to this Bund, regularly you would see markets, and you could smell chestnuts roasting and sweet potatoes and corn on the cob, and you would see beggars, and you'd see scribes writing letters to families, you'd see people cleaning ears. There were just all kinds of things that were pretty exciting for people on their way, including scaffoldings that went up within a few hours by the side of a building in order to take the body out of a window so that the spirit would not remain in the building forever and be captured and haunted. So for us, funerals were exciting because depending on the wealth of the person who had passed away, you would have a crowd following, and sometimes you'd have what they called rent a crying crowd. So you could rent a crowd to cry professionally, and they would wail loudly, proclaiming the wonderful life this person who passed away had spent, and the benevolence of the person, and so on. Next slide, thank you. Yes. So this was my first ancestor who arrived in Shanghai from India. She decided that she was not going to wait in India anymore for my great-great-grandfather because they lost a child and she wanted to be with him. It took months to do the trip, of course, and he was ship's captain. So they were obviously shipping opium at the time too, including all the things that were going back and forth from India to China, cotton and silks and spices and everything nices, as the saying goes. And so they stayed in Xinjiang province on the ship until my great-grandmother, here she is on her wedding day, was school-going age, and then they went to Shanghai. At the time, the registry wasn't open, but my father told me that family legend had it that we were the first Jewish family back in China in that era. But I always say that we came simultaneously with the Sassoons and Hardoons, and we actually are in the Sassoon family stream as well. As you can see, this is a great picture of them. My great-grandfather, born in India, traveled across he was in Siberia and traveled across overland and learned to dance the trepak and could balance chairs, and studied medicine in England, but didn't qualify, but still wasn't stopped or prevented from diagnosing ailments of anyone who had anything that they wanted to ask him about a particular medical problem. Now, Shanghai at the time was a metropolis. This is the wing on department stores, several floors. Everything was haute couture in Shanghai. They considered themselves a cut above all other Chinese. And things were imported from all the top centers in the world. And on every floor of a building like this, you had a different thing. You had a tea room like a restaurant. And then you had a tea dancing room where you could go and dance all afternoon or evening. And then you'd have a gambling hall, and from the windows of which some people sometimes threw themselves out because they had lost all their earnings. They were great gamblers. My own grandparents owned 6 racehorses. They were always at the races, and they won a ton of money. My mother said they couldn't close their bags when they went home. And so here's my grandmother. These are my paternal grandparents. Her wedding day, you can see how well dressed they are. And he was called the Timor King because he had the biggest chairs in the Malaysian rubber plantation. And there's a big story to his life, which is rather sad, but I can't tell you everything, obviously, now in a few minutes. It's all in my book. I've covered everything in total detail. And one of the people watching here today has actually, Yitzhak Kerem, has actually endorsed my book. And here is my grandmother in her fur coat in front of their mansion. And she took a photo every year in her new fur coat acquisition. Rather haughty, very benevolent, beautiful house. Next slide, please. And this is the house with tons of rooms. My mother said 24 rooms, but I haven't been able to count. And at the back, there was a swimming pool and a tennis court. In the front, there were 2 Sikhs at the gates, and they would cook curry, and my mother said that the smell of the curry would waft across the lawns. On Shabbat, everyone after the synagogue service was invited. People would be running all over the lawns. Trays would be coming out, silver trays with silverware and cut glass, and people stayed all day, and then they carried on playing poker and other games at night, and the women sat and gossiped. Next slide, please. This is my father. He was 6 foot tall, which was very tall at the time. They said that he was like a prince, and my mother used to see him riding past with a horse and buggy, and then later he had his own car, and his siblings all rode in another car. They were amongst the first people in Shanghai to have a car. They were well dressed, as you can see, always on a fob watch and everything. Now, this is my mother's family. My grandfather was a rabbi. My mother was born in Persia, and she is on the extreme left. You can see the mischief on my mother's face. My mother was 5 times a sports champion. Nothing challenged my mother. Actually, she got us through the war in one piece and with a terrific view of life and outlook. So I have to thank her for that. And here are all her siblings. My grandfather took up a post as rabbi in Shanghai and gave it up to be the shochet because he said someone else needed it more than he did. He was actually a Kabbalistic rabbi. Next slide, please. And my mother, gorgeous, in her in the 30s. She was proposed to 32 times by different people who came to request her hand in marriage. And she always looked gorgeous, and she actually started a dance school in Israel, which became really very well known, and taught yoga until she was 95 years old. She passed away when she was 98. This is their wedding in Shanghai with siblings and cousins, a couple of cousins. It took place at the ASTOR House Hotel, the first place to get electricity there. And here's my mother looking gorgeous, and my father, as you can see, his brother also behind him on the right, very tall, and my mother's brothers flanking them on either side, and my father's sisters in front. Next slide. The wedding took place in the ASTOR House Hotel in 2 ballrooms. This is the wedding cake, and they had over 600 people attending the wedding. It was absolutely spectacular, and we still have the wedding gifts for years and years after that. So next slide, thank you. Now, this was 1937, the year of my birth, which I'm not ashamed to say. And it shows a wonderful photograph about people conveying other people on wheelbarrows and rickshaws and pedicabs and whichever way they could, or even on their shoulders, which I don't have a photograph of here. And that was how people got around. And then the Japanese had what they called incidents, and they bombed Shanghai and the Chinese. They were constantly starting a fight. And so my mother was evacuated on the ship. Next slide, please. Which was jam-packed, people not sleeping on the decks, people sleeping in deck chairs, several people in cabins, whoever could get into a cabin. And she went to Hong Kong, where she gave birth to me. Next slide, please. And then in 1941, directly after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese marched into every major business, demanded all the keys and the information and the ledgers, and all all British, Americans and Belgians and all allies were issued armbands, which they had to wear, which showed that they were designated to be interned, which we were we were actually interned for 2.5 years. Everyone else went in before us. They were there 3 years, and we were interned with all the officials, together with our officials who had stayed out till the end to take care of all the affairs of the people and see that it was an orderly internment. There were 8 or 9 camps in Shanghai, and we were interned in our school, in the public school. Next slide, please. In 1951, we were living in Hong Kong. After 1948, my father and mother decided that we had to leave Shanghai because the communists were coming in, which they did pretty soon. We ended up in Hong Kong for 3 years, where my father once again lost everything due to the embargo of the Korean War. And we had nothing left then because the Japanese had already taken it all at the beginning. And so my mother said, we must go to Israel. And we left within like 2 weeks and left my father behind for 4 months to wind up. And we went to Israel and lived in a tent and lived in a hut. And it was a pretty tough time, but very exciting for us to be in Israel. Then next slide. In 2005, this photograph emerged in a bulletin that was going out to all the British people trying to recoup money from the Japanese, which we never recovered, and neither did the British ever give us any reparations, although they gave it to others because they said we were not British enough. And so this photo of me on a swing at a ship's party that was given to the children who had been interned during the war. emerged, and I was invited as a guest to BBC One, and next slide, please. Took part in a program called We'll Meet Again, and I became the spokesperson to thank the 3 sailors who are sitting right next to me for inviting us to the ship at the time. And all the people who are beside me and behind us were all children on that ship at the same time as I was. Most of them were in my camp, some were not. And I was then in touch with all of them again. So, of course, I had to finish my book after that. And so I completed my book. It took many years because there was so much research to go into it. And I have masses upon masses of information in my book because it was very important for me to get this out. It covers all the ethnic groups who lived in China. And I felt that we had to pay homage to the Chinese for what they did for us. They were very, very good to us always. There was never any anti-Semitism on their behalf from us. And that's my story. Thank you so much.
That's quite a story. I'm left breathless listening to you. So right now, I would like to invite the audience to start thinking of what questions they would like to ask our 2 illustrious speakers. We don't recognize raised hands, so I'm going to ask you to put any of your questions into the chat box. And in a few minutes, my colleague Robert Jacobitz will pull out as many questions as he can, and he will ask them to whoever the questions are directed to. Right now, I'm simply taking the floor back briefly to tell you about what's coming up at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So next week, we have our final program of this first series of programs of the year. And then we will have a hiatus until after Passover. We will start again on April 24th. But right now, I want to urge you to sign up for next week's program, which is about a remarkable figure. His name was Peter Bergson. And he read a newspaper article in 1942 when he was living in Washington, D.C. He read an article, small article, saying that 2 million Jews had been massacred in Europe. And this was the first time that that kind of news was breaking out into the public, into the newspapers. And he read this, and his life changed that moment. He decided, from now on, what I'm going to do when I wake up in the morning until I go to bed at night is see what I can do to persuade the US government to rescue the Jews of Europe. And his efforts ultimately led to the creation of the War Refugee Board and the whole action of Raoul Wallenberg. So Peter Bergson is a figure that you really should know. So next week's moderator is Professor Mordechai Paldiel, who is our resident historian, who sits on our board of directors and who was for almost 25 years at Yad Vashem as the director of the Department for the Righteous. So right now, we're going to play the trailer to the film that you're going to see. It's called Not Idly By. And then after you see the trailer, I will invite Dr. Paldiel to say a few words about the importance of the Bergson story.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mordechai Paldiel. Ever since the end of the Holocaust and World War II, people have been asking, how did the Jewish community and its leaders in the United States respond to the evolving, frightening news of the mass extermination of Jews by the Nazis taking place everywhere in Europe? Also questioned is the response of the United States government, headed by President Franklin Roosevelt, who was very popular among Jews. Next week, on Sunday, March 20th, 3 leading scholars will debate this issue, as well as the role of the late Hillel Cook, better known as Peter Bergson, who was a nephew of the chief rabbi, Avraham Kook, the chief rabbi in Palestine then. and who arrived in the United States in 1940 from the land of Israel, then known as Palestine, and led a campaign to arouse the Jewish public and its leadership from passivity and backdoor diplomacy, and instead lead a public campaign to pressure the United States government to do something to at least reduce the scope of the Holocaust. Well-known historian Raphael Medoff, who has written a lot on the American scene during that period, will be joined by filmmaker Pierre Sauvage, who has produced the film Not Idly By, in which the late Peter Bergson speaks about his efforts among Jewish and non-Jewish circles to do more on various rescue efforts. And Bergson's daughter, Israeli historian Rebecca Cook, who was privy to her father's thoughts on this, well, all these three luminaries will discuss these efforts by Bergson and his partner, film playwright Ben Hecht, efforts that led to the creation of the War Refugee Board that saved thousands of Jews. The film, Not Idly By, plus the perspectives of these three historians will surely add to your knowledge on the response or lack of response of both Jewish and non-Jewish circles to the news coming from Europe on the Nazi extermination of all the Jews under their control. So I invite you all to sign up for this interesting program and invite your friends to join as well. I assure you, you will not be disappointed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mordechai. So Robert, I think it's time now for you to moderate the audience questions, please.
Great. Thank you, Olivia. And we have a significant number of questions, which is always a wonderful thing and a challenge at the same time. I think the first question that was important to some people because they commented upon it was, Esther, what did you mean when the reparations were to British citizens, your family was not British enough? Can you elucidate, expand more on that, what it meant?
Sure. The British decided to give reparations to all who were interned at the time. And so they sent out all kinds of questionnaires. And then they decided that because we didn't have a British bloodline literally from England, we were not British enough to get the reparations, after which there were court cases against them. And in the end, they gave us some kind of token amounts. It wasn't the amount that they had given to all the British, but it was terribly unfair. And also at the beginning, they did give it to some people, but then they called it off because they changed the goalposts and decided that we were not British enough. And
was it because you were quote unquote from a colony, and therefore you were not British from Britain, proper?
They used that as an excuse, but basically it was only the Jewish people. There were about 200 families, and that was it. We didn't get it.
So it was the Jews. Interesting. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that people have seen the cover of your book, but I wanted them to know, how did the title come about? Hiding in a Cave of Trunks. Tell us about that.
So we were allowed to take what we could carry into the camps. And because our first camp was up the road from where we lived, and it was in the place where my mother had gone to school, we had Chinese people carrying on carts, taking our things, and we took trunks in with things, with our possessions, as much as we could carry. And when the bombs were falling around us during the camp period, my mother put the trunks side by side and trunks on top. And she said, come on, I've made a cave of trunks and we're hiding in my cave of trunks so that you would try to take the fear from us. And I've never forgotten that. And we all got under these trunks, and if anything would have fallen, it would have fallen onto the boxes on top of us and not on our heads. That was how it came about.
Okay, great. One question is, do you have any knowledge of the number of Jews that were in Shanghai at that time and those who were incarcerated, sent to the camps?
No, I do not. But in our camp, there were 3 families only. And remember that up to the year 1920s, there were only about 700 Jews there anyway. And so
Okay.
the only people who were interned were basically the Sephardi Jews who were British, because it was the Allies only who were interned. The rest of them, the refugees, were all put into the ghetto, as you know, Hongqiu. And so there was no way for us to exactly know how many Jews, because we weren't in touch with the other camps as far as that was concerned. But not my family, my father's family was all interned in other camps.
Oh, okay. I know you write about it in the book, and the question was, you know, what were the conditions in the camps? Tell them again, the diet, the cleanliness or lack thereof. Sure.
It was pretty tough. It was awful. We actually had roll calls morning and night. The Japanese love to slap a face or two to show that they were in charge, because that means you've lost face once they've done that. And we had kitchens set up. My mother ran the children's kitchen, and the other kitchens were the major kitchen. Everyone had duties, and there were cooks and there were people for cleanup, and you had to take part in your duties. So they were pretty well organized with that. And we had very little food, and the Japanese stole all the parcels that came from the Red Cross. And after the war, we found it all. I don't know what's happened to my slides. Gosh. Okay, so they gave us very little food. We had marrow bones that we ate, and bad cabbages, black cabbages and potatoes, all rotten stuff, and 1 egg a week. And yeah, it was, and we were all very, very thin. My book has got photographs of lots of things that happened. Ton of photographs.
Right. That again, people really need to write a book. It's an excellent understanding of what happened to your family and others during the Second War. And I know that's part of your life's goal, is to educate more and more people.
It's
important. And you've done a marvelous job in doing that, Esther.
Thank you very much.
One of the things that I've read that I wanted people to know further, which I found to be so disappointing, that after you all were incarcerated and were really abused there, and there's no other word to describe it, you then were able to attend a British-sponsored school post-internment, and then, as one of the few Jewish children there, you were mercilessly subjected to anti-Semitism. Can you tell more about that? Which is, again, as you said, that woman, scolded you, but there's a certain degree of anti-Semitism in British society that can't be denied.
Right. Well, in Shanghai, it was bad. And someone else wrote a book in which she featured a page, gave me a full page of how she was witness to an anti-Semitic incident that I experienced and subjected to. And the kids were constantly fighting me. They'd gang up. And then in Hong Kong, it got even worse. It was really difficult. But there was this girl who was in one of the pictures that I showed of the party. And when I came across her again, years later at the party, and she once again said to me, "Oh, look at you. Every time I see you, you're eating, you're feeding your face." Well, she happened to look extremely ungainly. And I said to her, "Yes, and aren't I lucky I can?" And she just froze up, and I got my own back.
Good for you. Good for you.
It was a sweet feeling.
You were in a camp, again, the internment. The Japanese knew you were Jewish? I mean, was there any anti-Semitism from them, or they just hated other people?
No, they didn't have any anti-Semitism, actually. The Japanese, they had, Meisinger went to Shanghai to try to get them to have a final solution for the Jews in the ghetto, and they said no. And this, a guy, Schiff, who was a banker, had helped them during their war, the Japanese-Sino war against the Russians. And so they were not. And the Chinese also had no anti-Semitism. All of it came from the British and the Russians. That was who was anti-Semitic at the time.
And do you know of that the Jewish experience is taught as, again, as part of Chinese history relative to the Japanese in the Second World War? Is there any inclusion or recognition of the Jews being prisoners?
The Japanese actually don't, the Chinese, they don't recognize Judaism now as a religion in China. Yeah.
So obviously what you're saying is obviously then Jews are not part of the history of China.
Well, you know that the young Chinese people today are fascinated because they know very little about the history of Jews in China. However, today Rabbi Greenberg has brought in a whole lot more Jewish people. There are about 2,000 Jews, I think, now in Shanghai on both sides of the river, Pudong and the side that we lived on, the Bund. At the time, Pudong was really just a riparian riverbank, and people were washing clothes in the water there, and but today it's the buildings are probably amongst the very tallest in the whole world.
Okay.
Robert,
Thank you.
we have about 10 more minutes, so I'm wondering if you have some questions that are directed to Nicholas.
I was just getting to that. Thank you, Olivia. Nick, again, I apologize for saying that you're 22. It's even better that you're 20 in all of that you've accomplished. And I guess one of the questions is from one of the people in the chat is, what are your, in addition to, I guess, what your interest in expanding people's information about Kaifeng Jews is to have a documentary, to be able to share that information. Do you have any other books in the offing or any specialization that you want to work on as you continue to tell the story of, again, the history?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So I've done a lot of research on the history of Judaism in China, and I think that to be very honest, there's not a huge amount of information on sort of manuscripts or sort of archaeological artifacts regarding the Kaifeng Jewish community. And so I think I've done a lot of the research. I think now, instead of just continuing to do research that nobody's going to sort of look at, I'd rather want to kind of pivot my sort of direction to making sure that the research that I've already done is as accessible as possible. And that's why I think that books are nice, but I do think that sort of to reach people in my generation and children, it's important to sort of find different mediums, so like a documentary, which is really how people learn these days, or children's books. And so I kind of want to sort of go that direction. And as for whether or not I have any books in the making, so right now I kind of want to focus on the children's book angle. I think that there are a lot of benefits to this, in that I'm able to sort of reach a much bigger audience through children's books. Another thing that I've done research into, which is really beyond the scope of this presentation, is it's actually among the sort of Asian American and sort of white American intermarriage rate, a disproportionately high amount is Chinese immigrants with Jewish communities. And so I think there's a sort of a very natural demographic of children and sort of who would be interested in this. I also think that what's interesting about it, and so another talk that I'm giving over the next few weeks is I'm giving sort of a small interactive session with children at the Kushner Hebrew Academy. And they live in somewhat sort of communities where they don't get too much exposure to non-Jewish communities in terms of formal education. And so I think this is a fantastic way to sort of introduce to them different and sort of worldly cultures while still sort of staying within the realm of Judaism. And I think there's a lot of sort of directions I can go from there.
Go ahead, Mordechai, go ahead.
Can I say something? Nicholas, you at the start of the program, you asked about Israel. I would recommend, before you go to Israel, to get in touch with two institutions. One is Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Institution, and tell them that you're looking for information about Jews in Shanghai and other places, in Harbin during World War II. And the other institution is called the Diaspora Museum. That is the University of Tel Aviv. And the Diaspora Museum, they may have more information on Kaifeng, about the story, because what they do at the Diaspora Museum, it's the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora throughout the world, and they may have something on Kaifeng. So check out before you go to Israel.
Thank you. Yeah.
The Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv and Yad Vashem. You log in on your Google and you get the address right to them. And so maybe it'll help you out in your research.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nicholas, I have a question. Is that I don't remember what your majors are at school, but do there any confluence between what you're doing now with the Kaifeng Jewish community and what you see yourself doing professionally in some respect?
I think going forward, one thing that so actually I grew up in England. I went to a sort of Anglican British boarding school, and so like I said, I wasn't exposed to much Judaism or Jewish communities through formal schooling. And one of the reasons I chose to go to the United States was so that I can explore, like, through liberal arts, I can really learn about East Asia, I can learn about Judaism. And so coming to the US was really prompted by my sort of interest in Chinese Judaism. I think going forward, so just to give you a little bit of context, this year I'm going to Israel for the first time from September to December for an exchange program with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So if you know anybody in Israel who'd be interested, definitely let me know. Send me an email. I'd be very grateful. And another thing is that I guess after I graduate, which is going to be in like 2.5 years, I guess, is that I'd love to do a master's in either, I guess, Chinese history or Jewish history, and kind of go from there. As for whether or not this will be part of my professional career, or sort of if I'm going to go into academia, I don't think I know. I definitely want to do a master's and do education regarding this afterwards. But what I can guarantee is that no matter what I do professionally, this will always be the sort of core sort of feel behind anything that I do. And I want to sort of continue proliferating this enriching part of history.
That's great. We have a couple more. I have one last question to ask you. Are you aware of there is a Sino-Jewish dialogue group, is the best way that I call it, an organization out of Seattle? Do you know anything about them or what their work is?
Yeah, so the Sino-Judaic Institute, I think it's the president is Rabbi Anson Leitner, and I think so he's somewhat of a good friend of mine, and one of the articles about me was on their recent journals a few years ago. I think Points East is what it's called. I haven't been to Seattle before, and so I haven't had a chance to check them out. But my website is called the Chinese Jewish Institute. Theirs is called the Sino-Judaic Institute. Kind of similar names, but I guess like there are not too many creative ways to name this while still being straightforward. I kind of want to explore ways to sort of work with them and sort of achieve common goals, because their platform is way bigger than mine. Mine is like me and like a few friends. Theirs is like they've got a board and they have resources, and so I kind of want to be able to sort of team up with them. And I think that what's great about these talks is I'm able to grow exponentially in terms of my network and in terms of different opportunities. And so, yeah, I think, if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my website, or you check out Sino-Judaic Institute. There's so much you can do. I think I know like we're kind of like hitting the end of the time period, but I do think that I want to highlight the importance of, I think, learning about both China and Judaism is important on many, many levels. First of all, I think Chinese and Jewish values are actually remarkably similar when you actually get down to the weeds of it. There's the idea of communal values and sort of ancestral veneration, et cetera, et cetera. And these create for very similar experience within both, modern America and historically, right? So like, for example, if you're looking in the United States today, there's a lot of papers about the model minority myth, about how, and I think this is something that there are sort of implications of this research. And moreover, there's a lot of, sort of future, like what are the implications of, Chinese Jewish history on Sino-Israeli relationships going forward. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can sort of spin the wheel. And I don't know where I'm going to go with this, but I think there's a lot of room to play around.
That's great. That's great.
Now, Esther, I'm wondering if you have some final thoughts you would like to share with our audience today. And please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I want to say that I really valued the years that I spent in China. It was a fabulous time for us. It's always, as anyone who lived in China will tell you, it stays in your blood forever. You never quite get over it. And I think it's extremely important for the world to know what actually happened to the Jews who lived in China, and also to the big tycoons who built Shanghai. Sassoons, Hardoons, Kaduris, the big names, including my family, the Benjamins. And I'm determined to get the word out as much as I can. And it's not in your face because it's a very interesting history. And it's really important. It brings people together. And I have a number of Chinese friends because of that. And I just absolutely love it. I cherish the time that my family spent in China.
So I urge everybody in the audience to order Esther's book, Hiding in a Cave of Trunks, to order any or all of Nicholas's 3 books. And thank you all for joining us. What a beautiful big crowd we've had here today. Thank you to Robert for moderating and Mordechai for speaking about next week. And I'm sorry we didn't get to every question. There were just too many. But I'm sure our speakers would be happy to continue the dialogue by email. So if you do have questions, write to us. We will forward your questions.
And thank you. And thank Nicholas as well. He was wonderful, really wonderful. Thank you for
that. Terrific. So see you all next week, I hope, and be well. Have a nice rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.